A
Imagine
single
being
vote in the
handed
U.S.
the
Senate
keys
can
to a
freeze the most
$100
powerful
billion
government on Earth.
machine
But right
that
now,
8 million
a
people
political
rely on to
standoff
survive.
threatens to blow up
And
the
your
rules
first
forever.
job is to fix it
we are
while it's
watching
running
the
at top
fundamental
speed.
machinery of
Yeah,
American
I mean, that is just a
lawmaking just
completely wild
grind
scenario
to
to
an
step
absolute
into.
halt.
Right.
And honestly, the
So,
physical
welcome
toll
to
on the
today's
people
deep
inside
dive.
that building is about
We are
to become
taking you
very
right
real.
into the room
Right,
for the
so let's
first
set the
3
scene.
months of New
It's
York
March
City Mayor
2026.
Zohran Mamdani's
Picture the
administration
hallways of the
in
United
early
States Capitol right now.
2026.
And
just think about the sheer scale of the job awaiting him on day one.
into
Oh,
back
absolutely.
offices.
You walk
Oh,
into
yeah.
City Hall,
Staffers
drop your
are stockpiling
briefcase,
energy drinks
and the
by the
dashboard
case.
is basically just
We are looking at a
flashing red.
scenario
Right,
where
because
senators
you have
might
this
actively
massive
refuse to drink water,
$5.4 billion
just so they don't have to leave
budget
the
deficit
floor to use the
staring you
restroom.
right
Which
in
is
the face.
wild.
And on top
it's
of
all
that, you
because
have
the
small
Senate is
businesses
completely
struggling to survive the
deadlocked
winter,
over
the
slump.
Save
You've
It
got
America
global
Act
culture
Right,
wars
that big
playing out
election
on the
overhaul
streets.
bill.
Yeah.
It's centered
and,
around
this
measures like
massive
voter ID
campaign
requirements.
promise.
Right, the promise
Democrats
to
are
build a
aggressively
fundamentally
blocking this
fairer,
legislation,
self-described,
and Republicans
socialist-leaning
desperately want to
economy.
pass it.
Yeah.
But
right
they
in the
lack
beating
the
heart of
60
global
votes
capitalism.
required to Exactly.
break
It's
the
just a
stalemate.
fascinating setup.
Which means
It really is.
frustrations
It's like
are
the
just
ultimate
boiling over.
real-time stress
Today,
test
you have
of
28
theory
Republican
versus
senators,
reality.
people like Pete
We get
Ricketts
to see
and Cynthia
exactly
Lewis
what happens
demanding
when these
that
grand
the Senate
political
force
visions
a
hit the
grueling,
very
physical,
loud,
talking
very
filibuster.
complicated pavement
They want to force
of America's
Democrats
largest
to
city.
stand on the
figure out
floor
how
and
this actually
talk
works
until
in
their
practice, we
vocal
are
cords
pulling
just
from a
give out. And
massive
if that
stack of
fails,
sources
they want
today.
to
Right,
break
we've
the
got,
standing rules of the Senate
official New York
entirely
City
to force
press
a final
releases
vote.
and the
real shocker
Wikipedia
dropped
records
just a few
detailing
days
the
ago.
administration's
Senator
timeline.
John
We also
Cornyn,
have deep
a man
financial
who
analysis
fiercely
from
defended
the
the
Fiscal
old Senate
Policy
rules for his
Institute.
entire
And
career.
to
balance that out, we
just
have a really
published
strict
this
policy
fiery
critique
op-ed
from the
Right,
Conservative
saying
Heritage
Republicans must
Foundation.
act
Yeah,
now
so
to
our
get
mission
this bill
today
passed.
is to
Yeah, he said they had to
basically
deal a
extract the
fatal
most
blow to
important
the rules,
insights
which
about what
instantly
happens
triggered
when
a
this
massive
ambitious
public call-out
agenda
from former
collides with
Senator
the
Joe
gritty
Manchin.
daily realities
Manchin
of running
slammed
a city.
Cornyn
But
online for
we do need to put out a
massive
crucial
flip-flop.
impartiality
Because the rules of the Senate
disclaimer
are
before we
quite
really get
literally
into the
hanging
weeds
by a
here.
thread
Yes,
right now.
absolutely.
I mean, the
Look,
decisions
our
made in the
sources
next few
feature
days will
highly
dictate how
politically
American
charged
laws are
viewpoints
written for the
today.
next century.
We have the mayor's
Welcome to
progressive
this
policies
deep
on
dive.
one side and the Heritage
Today,
Foundation's
we have a
right-wing
custom mission
critiques on the
tailored
other.
just for you.
So we want to be super
We're going to
clear with you that we are
explore the
entirely
swashbuckling,
impartial here.
pirate-filled
We aren't
origins of the
endorsing any
filibuster.
political viewpoint.
It is a
not
crazy
the left,
history.
not
It
the
really
right.
is.
Exactly.
We'll also
We're
break
simply
down the
conveying
terrifying
the factual
parliamentary
events
weapon
and the
known as the
arguments
nuclear
exactly as they
option.
appear in the source
And finally,
material.
we will
We're just
unpack a
putting both sets of
mind-bending
blueprints on the
mathematical
table.
concept
Right. We just want
called
to
the
take the engine
Manchin
apart,
paradox.
look at
Right,
the pieces
which
and
proves
see
exactly
where the
why
math
politicians
actually
use
leads us.
gridlock
So
as a
let's
highly
start with the
calculated
administration started,
mathematical
which is the
strategy.
local
So,
economy.
by the end of
Specifically,
this
like people running
conversation,
the corner
you will
bodegas,
hold
Yeah.
the
the
secret
independent hardware
decoder
stores,
ring for the chaos you see
neighborhood
on
ice
the
cream
news.
parlors.
Yeah.
You will understand
And
the
Mamdani's
hidden
primary
game theory
economic pitch
that
right out of the
drives
gate
these
is
high-stakes
this
showdowns.
$80 million Absolutely. initiative
Okay, let's unpack
called the
this.
NYC
Before we can
Future
truly
Fund.
grasp
which he
the
immediately
physical
threads
threats
with
and the
Executive
massive
Order 11.
stakes
Okay,
of
let's
this
unpack
2026
this, because
SUV America
trying
Act
to open a
standoff,
small business in New York
we
City
really need to look
often
at what the
feels like playing a
filibuster
board
actually
game where the
is.
rules
And more importantly,
change
how it
every
started.
single turn.
Right,
and the
because
bank
it
is always
wasn't
angry
designed
at
this
you,
way
and
by the
every time you
founders,
roll the
right?
dice,
Like
you owe
this
someone
wasn't in
money.
the blueprint.
Exactly.
Not at all. If
So
you read the
Mamdani's
U.S.
Constitution
Constitution, you
wants
will
to
not find the
build,
word filibuster
like, a
anywhere in the
financial
text.
shock
Wow,
absorber
nowhere.
for these
Nowhere.
businesses.
The
And if you
Constitution
look at
basically
the
gives the Senate
statistics
the
on this
authority
future
to set
fund,
its own internal
they are
rules.
highly
So back in
specific.
1789,
They
during the very first
aggressively
sessions,
target the
debates ended
hurdles
with just a
that
simple
smaller,
majority vote.
often
Okay,
immigrant
so
or
51
minority-owned
votes, and you're
businesses
done.
faced
Exactly.
with traditional banks.
But there was this
Right.
Because
massive
under the
loophole.
old system,
They
the
never
minimum loan size you
codified a
could get
specific
from
procedure
city-backed
to force
programs
a vote to
was
happen if someone
often
simply
around
refused to stop
$100,500.
talking. Wait, hold on. If I
So
run a
without a
tiny
mechanism
local
to
coffee
cut off
shop
debate,
and my espresso machine
politicians
breaks,
figured out
I
they
don't
could
need
just,
$100
you know,
grand. I
hold
just
the
need
floor
maybe
hostage.
$10,000 or $15,000.
We actually have
to fix
diaries
it.
from the very
Which
first
is
session
exactly
of the
why
Senate.
the previous system
Pennsylvania
wasn't
Senator
working for the
William
smallest
McClay
players.
wrote down his sheer
The new
frustration
administration
that senators
slashes
from
that
Virginia
minimum
were
loan size
intentionally talking
all the
away
way
the
down to
clock.
$25,000.
Just to make sure a specific
Oh,
bill
wow,
couldn't
that is a
pass.
huge
Right.
drop.
They literally
and they lowered the
weaponized
interest
the
rates to
clock.
7.5%.
I mean, if they were holding the legislative
Plus,
process
they dropped the
hostage,
minimum
makes
revenue
perfect sense why the
requirement
press
to
eventually
just
started calling them
$50,000.
pirates.
But I think the most
Which brings us to the
interesting
actual
mechanical
word
shift is how they handled
filibuster.
repayment.
Yeah, it's easily
Right.
one
The
of the
flexible
strangest
plans
words
that
in
can
American
drop as low as
politics.
two
where does it
percent of
come
a
from?
business's monthly revenue.
The etymology
That
is
is a
fascinating,
massive
honestly. The
operational
term really
shift.
took
I mean,
hold
if
in the
you own a
1850s.
seasonal shop,
It comes from the
say,
Dutch word
neighborhood water
freebooter
ice stand,
and the Spanish
and it's
word
February,
filibustero.
your
which
revenue is
translates
practically
directly to freebooter
zero.
or pirate. And under a traditional
Yes.
bank loan, your fixed payment is
Specifically,
still due,
the
which just
mercenaries and
bankrupts you.
pirates who
But
raided
under this
Caribbean
revenue-based model, if
islands
you
and
make
Latin
less,
American
you pay
countries
less.
during
It
that
acts as a
era.
direct
So they were
injection
calling
of
these
capital that
distinguished
breathes
senators
with the
pirates.
business.
Exactly.
Pretty much.
But, getting
The term
cash is only
entered the
half the
political
battle.
lexicon
Which brings us
because
to
observers
Executive
recognized
Order
the
11.
behavior. Right. The red
senators
tape
who
order.
talked for hours
This forces city
were
agencies
literally
to
hijacking
review
the
the
Senate
roughly
floor.
6,000
Like taking the government
regulations
hostage, just like a
and
pirate taking
250
over a ship.
distinct permits that
So
currently
let's track
choke
how the
small
Senate tried to
businesses.
fight off these
Fascinating here is the
legislative
ideological
pirates.
split on how to
Because as
actually
the country
solve
grew,
that red tape
you couldn't
problem.
just have one
Because
person
both
shut
sides
down the
completely
entire
agree
government
that the
for weeks on
regulatory
end.
maze
No, you
is a
couldn't.
nightmare.
But it took
right?
a long
no one
time
likes
to
the
build a defense.
bureaucracy.
By the
Nobody.
early 20th
But the
century,
Heritage
these
Foundation
marathon
reads
speeches
Mamdani's
became
solution
catastrophic
and argues
for a
that he is
modernizing
simply
nation.
treating
I can
the
imagine.
symptoms,
So finally,
not the
in
root disease.
1917,
Oh, because
President
part of
Woodrow Wilson
Mamdani's plan
pushed the
includes
Senate
a
to adopt
500%
Rule
funding
22.
increase for one-on-one
This
small
rule
business
created a
support.
formal process
Right.
called
He wants to
cloture,
hire more
Cloture,
people
okay.
to help
which
entrepreneurs
is simply
navigate
a
the
mechanism to
bureaucracy.
force an end to debate.
Some local
But
business groups
here's
were
the
even
catch.
asking for
It
a mom and
required
pop
a
czar
massive
to report directly to the
majority
mayor.
vote to
And the
trigger.
Heritage
Two-thirds,
Foundation
wow,
pushes
which
back
is an
on
incredibly steep hill
Incredibly
to climb.
hard.
So
Their
stiff
argument is that
that over the
hiring a
next
czar
4
or adding
decades,
more
the
city-funded
Senate
help
only managed
desks
to
just
successfully
adds
invoke
more
cloture
bureaucracy
5 times.
to fight the existing
That
bureaucracy.
is
Oh, I
wild.
see.
Think
Yeah.
of it like a maze.
Southern senators
If you have
famously used this
6,000
exact tool
confusing
to
rules,
block civil rights
paying for more
legislation
government
years.
guides to hold a
The
business
gridlock
owner's
grew
hand
so
while they
intense
walk
that
through
in
it,
1975,
that doesn't fix the fact
the
that the
Senate
maze
lowered that
itself is
threshold from
fundamentally
2/3
broken.
down to 60
That makes a lot of
out of
sense.
the 100
So what is their
total
proposed
senators.
alternative?
They advocate
And
for
that
a
60
strict
vote threshold is
one
the
in,
number
one
that
out
dominates our
deregulatory
politics
budget.
today.
Exactly.
It is a lot
But
like a
here's where I
crowded
think a lot of
nightclub
people get
with a
confused.
strict bouncer at
When
the
we
door.
hear the word filibuster,
Okay, so if
we
the
don't
city
just
wants
think of
to
a
let a new
60-vote
regulation
math
into the
problem.
club, they must
We picture
force an
Jimmy
old,
Stewart and Mr.
outdated
Smith goes to
regulation to
Washington.
lead.
Right, a
Exactly.
classic
You cap
movie
the total
scene.
number of rules.
We picture a
They want to
single
shrink the
person
footprint
standing at a
of the
podium,
government
reading
itself,
the phone book,
rather than
sweating,
spending
refusing to
taxpayer
sit
money
down on more guides
But
to
senators
navigate it.
rarely do
That
that anymore.
perfectly
Why don't they
captures
have
the
to
classic
physically talk
debate
today?
over the role of
That
modern
is a
government.
crucial piece of the
Do
puzzle.
you build better
So
support
in the
systems within the
1970s,
state?
the Senate
Or do you
created
just
something
shrink
called
the
the
state's
two-track
footprint
system.
entirely?
Two-track system.
Right.
How does
To
that
let the
work?
free market
Well,
breathe.
before the
And that
system, a
philosophical debate
filibuster
leads
stopped
us
all
directly
Senate
into
business
a
completely.
massive, unavoidable
Nothing else could
brick
happen.
wall, which is
The Senate
city
realized
budget.
they had a whole
Yeah,
country
because
to
if you
run,
want to
so
build
they
this
changed the
financial
procedure.
shock
Makes
absorber
sense.
and hire
Under the
all
new
these
system,
support
if a
teams,
senator simply
you need
threatened to
cash.
filibuster
Right.
a bill,
How do you
the Senate
pay for a
leadership would just
fairer
set that
economy when
controversial
your
bill
administration
aside on a
inherits
different
a
track and
projected
move on to other
$5.4
business.
billion
Oh, wow.
deficit?
So they made it
The
painless.
short answer is
You didn't have to stand
you
up and
can't.
destroy your
You
vocal
have to make
cords
some
anymore. You just
incredibly
sent an
painful
email
choices.
saying, I
And
object,
we
and
see
the bill was
the
frozen.
administration hit that
Like a
wall
silent
almost
filibuster.
immediately.
You
with
capture
their
the
housing
dynamic
policy.
perfectly.
Yes. This is
The
where
physical
ideology
endurance
violently
requirement
collides
basically
with the bottom line.
vanished.
But the physical
During the
records
campaign,
from
Mamdani
before and
promised a
outside that
massive
silent
expansion
system,
to the city
those
FHP's
remain pretty
rental
legendary.
assistance
right
Oh,
now.
absolutely.
And just for those
Strom
unfamiliar,
Thurmond
this is a
spoke
voucher
against the
program
Civil
where
Rights
the
Act
tenant
in
pays 30% of their
1957
income toward
for
rent,
24 hours
and the
in
city
each
Imagine
covers the
finding
rest
out your
for
electric
24
bill
hours directly.
is
And the
secret-
modern
It's designed to
individual
keep
recommends
low-income
massive
New
building
Yorkers out of the
additions.
shelter
It
system.
is
does.
a
That's
pretty
But once
shocking
he took
to
off
someone who
25,
looks at the
Booker
math.
spoke
Right.
for an
Completely
astonishing
reversed.
Imagine for a
25
second
hours
that you
backed
have
out
a
an
savings
extension
account.
against the
entirely.
policies
The
of the
math
Donald
simply
Trump
became
administration.
undeniable.
I mean, just
or
think
they
about
had
the
to actually
boggling
balance
reality.
the
Check
checkbook.
25
Yeah.
hours.
The
This
cost
money
you
was
cannot
for that
sit down
specific
and
leaking
voucher
out lien on
program
your debt.
You can't even leave the
If we
chamber
don't
for
fix
a
this
bath.
roof,
on the scale
it is
here.
a
The
house
program
brutal,
costs the
It's
city
an
roughly
existential
$25
crisis
million.
for the house.
Exactly.
to
It's the
save the house
It
fund.
really
By
reminds me of
2025,
just
just 6 years later,
it decides to just yank the emergency
So what do you do?
throwing
Wait,
everyone
we need
else
to
into
pause
the
you
walls
there.
just because
You
they
take
How
don't
that
does
like
a
the
single
fact
city
that
program
until
multiply
you're
in
It is a
cost
highly
of 50
disruptive
times in
maneuver.
half a
Wait,
decade?
that raises a
That
glaring
is way
question.
beyond normal
If
inflation.
this plan, it comes down to
basic
basic
universally
climate
disruptive.
goals.
Mm.
The city's
Every
housing
single
supply
majority
is
party
self-strained,
absolutely
while
hates it.
demand
One
is
inflation
sky-high,
block,
which
which
naturally
naturally
drives
drives
up
up
base
base
budgets.
budgets.
Okay, that's completely
At the
avoidable.
same
That
time,
is the
previous
core
administrations
tension
expanded
of
who
the
was
United
eligible
States
for the
Senate
voucher.
Today we're
there.
exploring
The
a
reason
class
the
war piece
filibuster
of fiscal
survives
sleight
is
of
that
hand.
and the
permanently
actual
destroying
rent
it
the city
requires
had to cover for
maneuver
each
so
person
looking at the
extreme
strategic
and
and
so
sky
destructive to the
fund.
institution
And if
that it earned
Mamdani
a
expanded it
terrifying
further as he
empty promise of money. Projections
Exactly.
showed it
The
would environment the
nuclear
city
option
as
starting
a
to
Cold
hit
War
him
threat.
tax.
Let's walk
Every
through the
single person
mechanics.
paying an electric
The
bill in
administration
Maryland
looks at the
actually
$5 billion
launch this
$4
weapon.
center of a
Okay,
huge
let's break down the
political
looked at
intrigue.
that
You've
$17
got a
billion
Democratic governor,
changing
and
realized
environmentalist
written
city
rules
with
of
some
the
very
city
awkward
requires an
compromises,
overwhelming
and
It is a
conservative
brutal
critics who are
reality,
rightly
which in
calling
our
this
highly
whole thing a
polarized
shell
Because the
game.
city shell
politics,
game.
deficit
And
securing
when you look at the
67
documents we have
change
today,
rule,
it
reports
forces
basically
a bunch of
mathematical
proposals
square
for
for
money
money
from Senator to plug
So they
in
found a
$5 billion.
backdoor.
Really hard to
backdoor.
unsee.
Which
Brings
brings
up
up
a
a
striking
striking
that
bypasses
bypasses
the
the
follow the
67
money.
vote
To fix this
requirement.
massive
Always follow the
deficit,
money.
Mamdani
Here
wants
is
to
the
see
plan
how
Stefan
funds
almost
designed to
entirely
fight
on
climate
acting.
change
Governor
is
Kathy
being
Hochul
used
first
on the
told
state
Senate
legislature
majority leader
to
stands
tax
out, dig into the
corporations
argument that
this
this
isn't
isn't
found money
And
at
if the
all.
state
all.
doesn't
Basically
do that,
tells the
Mamdani
presiding
says New
officer
York City
that
property
the
taxes
written
will
rule
have
means
let's get
something
right into it.
entirely
The
different
strategic
than what
energy
the text
investment
actually
Wait, does
says.
this
Sound
mean the
majority
mayor's
leader
biggest
basically
financial
stands up and
solution
claims
actually
the
relies
sky is
entirely on the governor
essentially,
and the
on
state
paper.
legislature?
Then the
It is
presiding
state's
officer looks
If
the
we
meaning
connect this to the
book and
bigger
says,
picture,
the
No,
SIF
that
is
is
managed
managed
by
by
the
the
Maryland Energy.
And this is a
Text
dynamic
says what
that's
its whole
completely
state of
which is
purpose
the only
is to
logical
reduce
response.
because cities don't have total
But here is
financial
the
independence.
fund
Majority
rule
leader
energy.
immediately
A city
appeals
near
to
solar
ruling
panels and
infrastructure.
aggressive dreams.
Under standard
Exactly.
Senate
Conservative
But here
procedure,
is the real
deciding an
appeal
almost
only
always
requires
tethered
a
to the
simple
state's
majority
Where does
of
the money
51
actually
votes.
come
So
Cities
the
generally
majority parties,
cannot
they aren't
levy new
voting
types of
unison to
income or
override
corporate
the chair.
taxes.
And the
No, and
moment
that's why
they hit
politicians
51
absolutely
votes,
love it. It
they
feels great.
establish a
So about
brand new
40% of
binding
policy
precedent
regional
that
carbon
completely
down this current
overwrites the
standard. But the big
official
chunk,
written
the one
rules.
growing
Right
like
now,
crazy,
up in
that has come
Albany,
from something
the
called
state Senate is
They
actually
rewrite the
proposing a
rules
progressive
using a
tax
simple
or
majority
ACPs,
that
which is
aligns
just a
norms
fancy
with
government term
67
for a
vote
fine.
they want to
Right.
raise
It's a
in
fine
fire
for
failure.
failure.
It's
Let me
like
break it down.
$1 sitting down to play a
Maryland law
board game,
forces you
and
to
right
pay
in the middle of a
BESTCast.
tight
They would
match,
achieve
your
that
team
by
decides to
raising the state
rewrite the
corporate
instruction
taxes
manual
9%.
just because you happen to have one extra player at the table.
That's a great way to
taxes
put
on
it.
the
But that guarantees retaliation.
Yeah, the
So
state
the
gives
moment
them
the other
money
team
it
gets an
needs.
extra player,
utility
they're
gives
going
pay
to
a fee
rewrite a
directly to
different
the
plan.
state
Their
instead.
proposal
And
is
if we
much
connect this to the
narrower
bigger
and
picture,
entirely
here's you can see how this weapon
Meaning
has
if
steadily
utility
grown
taxes
as they collided over the
increasingly
last simply
justify
offset by
fine
taxes.
because
Every time a party
someone
pushes
Exactly.
that
So the
minor
mayor of
button,
New York
a
City
new
is
part of the
essentially
Senate
trapped in the
shatters.
middle of a
The
retaliation
line
level
is
tug of
getting
war.
more
To track that
rigorous.
state Senate wins,
When do they start
he gets the
putting
funding to
Well, the
build
term
his
itself
agenda.
came
Green
trashed
energy
in
And if the
mandates are
assembly
failing.
wins,
precisely
nothing.
nothing. It is a
And he might be forced to enact that incredibly unpopular 9.5%
but nuclear
property
stuck
tax
because it
on
implies
power
mutually
companies
which would
assured
absolutely
checks to the
crush
state instead of
middle
the first
class
major
alone,
launch,
and the
which is
stats on this are
exactly
Democrat
why
macroeconomics
led by Harry
in
Reid,
2022
frustrated
this
with
revenue was
Republican blockades.
$77 million.
The gears turning.
So they
like
used the
the
nuclear
nuclear
option
option
to drop
and
the
the
threshold
biggest
lever
lever
for
51
completely
votes for
firing
lower
them.
court
So
judges.
if your
and
budget is held
executive
hostage
branch
by the
nominees.
state, but they
Where does a
explicitly left
mayor
an exception for
Right,
actions
so
like
now the state
have
has
sovereign
But
power.
4 years
Right.
later,
Accidental
where
2017,
can you
the
show the
balance of power
voters
supposedly for
immediate
Green
progress?
Republicans,
You focus on the
remember,
physical
that money
environment.
didn't
You
just
focus
fall
on
out
the
of the
street.
sky.
And they
You
retaliate
literally
for that
fix
2013
the things
rule
people
change.
trip
So
over.
they
Do you
fired
think
back.
those
Ultimate
massive
display
corporations, they
of
used the
local
nuclear
pragmatism.
option to
If you can't
vaporize
balance
that
the billion
final
dollar
Supreme
budget
Court
overnight,
exception,
make sure
pushing
every
through
single penny
nominees
of
like
traffic
no
moves
horses.
in the
Exactly, it
sidewalks.
shows up right on your
Wow.
see
So
Mamdani
you nuke my
exercising
lower
the everyday
court
rate
nominees,
power
I nuke your
aggressively
Supreme
paying
Court
for 3
picks.
months,
And that
failure
exact
immediately
cycle of
advance
mutually assured
reforms to
destruction
the
brings
finally
us
take
directly
down
back
those
to the
massive
crisis
city
happening
scaffolding and
today
sidewalk
in
sheds.
Look at all
March
this cash we have.
2026.
Right back to the
Which brings us
standoff
to
over
the
the
rate.
Save America
And
Act.
he uses
Because
simple
that money
laws
wants this election
Sammy's
overhaul
law
staying in the climate.
to drop
Democrats are
speed
fiercely
limits
opposed
down.
to the
Enter
use of
Governor
silent
Les
filibuster to
Moore.
freeze the
His
legislation.
administration
Now
is staring
Donald
down
Trump
a
and those
projected
28 Republicans
$1.5
clarify how
billion
Sammy's law works.
They want to
Because it
tear
ties
up that
right back
comfortable
to what we
two-track
were
system
discussing
and
about
force a
state versus
grueling
You can't just ignore a
physical
hole that deep.
talking
Until very recently,
filibuster.
they
And
want to
when
bring up
government
in Albany,
overspends to
force
that
Democrats
degree,
to
they
dictate
start
the
checking under
speed
the
limits,
couch
or
cushions for
they want to
research.
push the nuclear button again
Except here,
and
it is
kill the
crazy that they
filibuster
had
for
energy
legislation
fund
entirely.
and the
Yeah,
least change.
Sammy's law was a
Crisis
hard-fought
highlights a
change
glaring
that
historical
finally gave
pattern.
New York
You
City
brought
the
up
legal
the
authority
the
to
governor's
lower its own
plan,
speed
Senator John
limits to
Cornyn,
protect
$292
pedestrians.
He also uses his direct power to roll back criminal summonses for minor e-bike offenses just to cover their overspending traffic tickets. They are using energy fines to pay for immigrant delivery workers getting a criminal summons for salaries, office supplies, you name it,
But that's not even all of
and
it.
you
I
potentially
read in the
risk
sources
reparations
there's
and
also a rebate
just for
scheme.
delivery.
Yes,
Changing
This is
that
the
to a
part
civil
critics are
traffic
calling
ticket
a political
fundamentally
partner.
changes their
Furiously
daily
grabbing
reality.
another $1.1 million out of the fund to give over one-time minority rebate on the eligible passions of the majority.
It's all about traditional.
So let me get this straight.
The
state mandates drive up energy costs.
For the utility companies pass those massive costs to you and me.
That is
Our
the
bills
definition
go
of
up only
hyperlocal
hundreds of
government.
dollars a
But,
year.
you know, the
Secretly
physical
want
And then
street
the
level
governor
is
takes
also
a
where
chunk
the
of our own
administration
money,
faced its most
hands us back a
painful
crisp
public
$40
That is the
bill.
$1
This brings us to
million
basically
question.
says,
Let's look at
Joe
Joe
Manchin in
That is
5
the
days
exact
into his
math.
administration.
It's wild. And if you look at the recent supplemental budget, they're cutting or shooting another $80 million. When you add all this up, this rage depletes the fund by 82%, being the controversial practice of city work, leaving only about $164 million for the actual green initiatives it was legally meant for.
But that is not a
Why
dream.
on winter
That's a
would a
total
politician
gut
willingly
And this is where
power
the
to
politics
pass
gets
laws
super interesting.
Well, the
Because
answer
you
has
assume
very
the
little. This is where
environmentalist
ideology,
groups
tradition,
like the
and
Sierra
reality
Club
are.
or the
It is
was a
actually rooted
devastation
in
sequence of
cold,
events.
hard
No,
mathematical
city
strategy.
officials
They
noted that the
were,
disease were not
initially.
necessarily
When
living in
this
the
first
specific
leaked, they
encampments
called
that
it
had been
unacceptable. They
They
said it was a visual reality to use
The
this money
Manchin
as a
paradox.
petty,
Okay, let's
forced
dive
an
into that.
immediate
But
reevaluation.
the
They
game
completely
was modeled
folded.
by researchers
Now
and
they are
human
actually
claims
supporting parts of the governor's statistical models to demonstrate why
strange
However, looking closely at
on
moderate
would they do
senators,
that?
just
If
revert
they
to the
truly
old
believe
system,
climate change is an
actually
existential
changed how the
crisis,
sweeping
why
more
let the
power
state
conduct
raid
when a
the
supermajority
survival
is
fund? There is an
required.
It's just
important
raw
administrative
political
nuance. Let's make
calculation.
this
They know
concrete.
voters are getting
Say I'm
crushed
the
by
Democratic
inflation and
leadership,
high
and
energy
I want to
prices
pass a
right now.
massive
If
led by
these
the
green
NYPD.
groups
Let's
attack
say I
a
want to spend
$40
primarily
rebate,
as a law
even if it's a
enforcement
total
issue.
$10 million
under
they look like they
Mamdani's
don't care about
new
working
protocol.
families. Now, let's
So
say
they have
Senator
sweeps are led
Manchin
by
they
the
are swallowing a
swing
very bitter
What
pill.
does that actually
in
change on the
exchange for
ground
letting
law?
the governor
The new
ideal moderate target is they are lobbying for a new law to create a funding floor.
They now require meeting residents.
Meaning they want to guarantee
simple majority
that the
ruling
state will
area.
mandate
If I am the leadership,
roughly
and I only need
$365 million a year on climate
I walk into his office,
trying to
so they are throwing
today's taxpayers
under the bus
to 8
before the lock down a permanent
We just
claim on
mapped
your
out
wallet
scenario.
later.
It's an attempt to thread and it brings us right to the core. He's trying to blend his progressive
People like
ideals.
Senate Minority Leader
harsh
Steve
life
Hershey
or death
slightly
reality
better for his
of
constituents than getting
Not for a
$0.
second.
You cannot just leave human
So
beings
really
outside to
exposes
freeze,
the math here.
but you also want to
He
treat them
casts
with
the
dignity
deciding
rather than
50-50
treating them like
rigorous
criminals.
about it's a balance that mayors across the country are struggling to find. And speaking of impossible balancing acts,
Right.
you
Because the final
cannot govern a
utilities
global
can't
hub like
so they
New
pay
York
the massive
City
fine.
without
Extreme
stepping
part
right
of
into the
it.
middle.
Utilities
National
raise your
and
election
international
rates
to cover the
But he
fines.
loses the
afford
policy.
the
State
state
grabs
grabs
that
so how does scenario
pay
B
for general
it is equal
government
blow.
stage.
Well,
Exactly.
scenario
So,
in
in
effect,
effect,
the state is taxing electricity.
The
sources show the administration trying to push forward on major social without ever having to publicly partner with the state on a massive
Hershey says Maryland
Which means they have to find those extra 9 votes
$1.7
somehow.
billion
Exactly.
plan. And to do that, they have to cross the aisle and win over moderate Republicans. And they create the city's first formal mayor's office for
And those Republicans are
and
giving
there's a second layer to this
aggressive
criticism.
cuts
But
to
the
that
biggest
$10
cultural
billion price
flashpoint
tag.
actually
This is
happened
Before
on
they
day
even
one.
consider voting, yes.
Mamdani used his very first day in
those
office to
Republican
sign
votes,
executive
Democratic
orders
leadership must
revoking several
drastically
directives that had been
slash
put in place by the former
the
mayor, Eric
gravitational
Adams.
pull
We
of the
have
Republican
zero
and those
forcing
specific
leadership
revoked
to
orders
critics
were
are asking a
taxes
very
all the
simple,
way down.
very
The Adams
devastating
administration had put
This
bills
is
in
the
place
most
that
urgent.
prohibited
Here's where it
city
gets
agencies
really
from
interesting. Why is
boycotting
the climate
Israel.
fund $6 billion
And they adopted
first thing you
specific
rate
definitions that
close
classified certain
mansions
criticisms
You don't
of
raid
Israel
your
as
life-saving
goal
surgery
of
fund to
$4
pay off your
billion.
credit
This
card.
raises
That's
an
the
important
grand
question.
reveal
Critics
of the
argue,
Manchin
how did the
paradox.
city
By
and the international
vigorously
community
protecting the 60-vote
react to
filibuster,
the mayor,
Manchin
keeping the
intentionally
government
gives up his
bureaucracy
glamorous
funded,
status. And again,
as
if you
way more
are
important
listening
to
and
them
wondering how
than the
this
green
affects the
projects they
political
claim
landscape,
by
remember we are
doing so.
explicitly
He forces
just
the
looking
entire
at fallout
Senate
as documented
to pull
in
the
the and it
legislation
entirely
significantly
undermines their
closer to
moral
his
authority.
just looking at
If the
tax.
money isn't sacred,
That is
then the
fallout
crisis
was
clearly
immediate
isn't as
and it
urgent
makes
as they
perfect
claim on cable
mathematical
news.
sense. Critics, let's talk about the real rules and lessons for the government, because while politicians are moving hundreds of millions around on spreadsheets,
Because their argument
It
was
affects
they
the
move raw
actual
voting
grid.
leverage to
What gets
gain
left
immense
behind
policy
when drains
discrimination with
82%
city
of the fund.
contracting and
Well,
city
programs
agencies.
for electric heat
And
pumps
how
for
did
low-income
Mamdani
households
study
and
proves
reflects
that moderate
And defended the
politicians
move of
defend the
the
60-vote
Socialist bill
rule
for to combat
because it
division
acts as a
and protect
permanent
free speech.
gravitational pull.
He
Instead,
pointed
they're
out in his
sacrificing
defense
long-term
that many progressive
legislation
Jewish
for a
organizations
$5
actually
political
didn't agree with the
that
previous
might cover your
administration
groceries
completely
today
reoriented how
because
you
they
view
argued that
gridlock in
those
Washington.
definitions conflated
When we see
legitimate
these
political
threats and
critique
here's
of
the
a foreign
ultimate reality.
government
It is not
with
just
actual
politicians before this
anti-Semitism.
race all children.
It is a
There's
perfect example of how a
rigorous
local
strategy
mayor whose
behind
primary
that
job
climate
is
target.
supposedly
When
fixing
you
potty
understand the
holes
game
and
theory,
balancing the
you
meal
realize
budget,
now
the mayor
acts as
suddenly
manages
expected to
parliamentary
navigate
reductions
highly
by
volatile
order
international
60%,
threat that
that's
they
a
were all
massive
just
part.
leverage
Every
in a
single
highly
action
University of
is
Maryland's
not
analysis
just by
shows
the
that
local
under
community
current
board, but on a
policies, the
global
state is
scale.
only going to
Massive
truly
fraud
40
today.
to 45
Which brings us to the overarching
mile
theme
of
of
hijacking the
first
Senate. So we are missing
really
the
the
target.
theme
The
of
grid is
any
getting
more
creation of
expensive.
the silent two
Governing
now
is the
the
brutal
money
art
into
of
politicians
fix
speaking for
this.
25
Flush
look at the
the
general
general
fund
fund
to
quite
cover a
timeline.
deficit.
It
is
and
a
we mapped
cascade
out
of
the
failure.
parliamentary
The
cheat code of
administration
nuclear
see a
option.
mayor
Explored the
shoot
explosive
down
2026
building
showdown
a
over the
socialist,
Easy Act
equity-driven
and finally
administration.
impact
He wants to
brilliant
radically
game
change
theory
how the city
that proves
operates.
gridlock
But the
actually
moment
be
he
a weapon
sits in
of
the chair
moderation.
and think about
He is
grid
entirely
mechanics of the
bound
Senate
by
are
capital
complex.
budget deficits
But the underlying
vastly
human strategy
technology
and
allowed.
state-level tax laws
penalize
that he doesn't
reliable
control.
energy
life
for
or death
death
winter
winter
weather
weather
matters
that completely the grid gets full. The next time you
That's
watch
exactly
the
why
evening
those
news,
fines
and
are
whether
so
you
high.
are
liable to
dragging
this from an
costs
apartment
available
in a
or
mega
demanding
city like New
nuclear
York.
option, you
So
now
from a
hold
house
the
in a
secret
quiet
to
rural
code.
town, New York City serves as the ultimate
And
stress
instead of
test
you
for
know that it's
modern
not just
policy.
random
Instead of
partisan
asking
meetings,
a
the
fundamental
mandates are
question,
unrealistic.
is a
at the limits of
high-stakes
government.
game of
just
mathematical
how much can
fines
local
is
leadership
calculating
actually
exactly
Which brings us
how
back
much
to the most
power
disturbing
we
part of this
massive
exactly how
macroeconomic
far
they
they
can push the rules
When the state
before we
capital controls your
entirely
tax
drill
revenue,
down.
and the global economy
stakes right
controls
now
your
in
2026,
$1.5
how much
billion
real power does a mayor? Every time a new precedent is established, and the Green Senate edges closer to
becoming we live in an era where local mayors are entirely expected to solve massive issues. Everything from international migrant crises to geopolitical boycotts.
We constantly complain about state budgets to function as independent sovereign nations without giving them the actual legal authority and tax power to do so.
Are we setting local leaders up to fail by demanding global results from municipal budgets?
It is a profound structural tension. It isn't going away anytime soon.
We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you. And
It's a
remember,
total
this is
dependency on
dangerous
failure.
bump in
The
bike
state
lane
needs
or
dirty
trying
energy
to balance
lines to pay its
$5 billion
dues.
deficit.
It's like a doctor who
Still
only
gets
gets paid
paid
if
if
he's
he's turning in a $100 billion machine while it runs at top speed.